Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. Tell us where you're from in the comments if you're watching right now. This story has been told for many years and has secrets that time has tried to erase, but can still be seen by those who are brave enough to look back. It is not true that this movie was made. It was just made for fun. Any resemblance to real people, live or dead, is just a coincidence. In the middle of Missouri, where the hills are. The people in the small town of Marshfield saw something that would change their view of safety forever, like keepers of lost stories. In 1897, summer was still going strong, and the wooden roofs and dirt streets were baking. The Wainwright family had just bought an old house on the edge of town. It was a strong building with thick walls and a basement that had been locked for years. The house used to belong to a single trader who left without giving any reason, leaving behind only hearsay and a tense atmosphere among the neighbors. The Wainwrights finally went down those creaky stairs, holding lanterns that flickered in the damp darkness. What they found was something that no one could have imagined. It wasn't just an empty storage room in the basement. There, among the cold stones and musty smell that stuck to the walls, were signs of a life that had been cut short too soon. Personal items were strewn around in a messy way. There were dark marks on the ground and floor that looked like they were speaking. There was so much quiet that it felt like it weighed itself down. As Thomas Wainwright, the head of the family, adjusted his eyes to the dim light, he felt the air leave his lungs. He began to understand how big the thing in front of him was. The local officials were called right away. Edmund Garrett, the veteran sheriff of Webster County, came down those same stairs with a look that was a mix of doubt and fear on his face. That afternoon, what he saw turned an everyday day into something that would change his life. Career for life. The discovery is written about in careful, almost hesitant language in the county archives from the time. It's as if the words themselves were afraid to fully describe what was happening at that moment. Someone tried to hide something there by hiding secrets deep in the ground, and over time in the hopes that no one would ever find them. The news quickly spread through the city like a prairie fire. Before, Marshfield was only known as a place where people would stop on their way across Missouri. Center of an investigation that would make newspapers in faraway towns pay attention. People started whispering names and remembering disappearances that at the time seemed like just people leaving on their own. They also started to wonder how many other secrets were still buried beneath the area's old foundations. The Wainwright basement had only shown the very beginning of a much bigger secret. That house was linked to a string of scary events that happened more than 10 years ago. And now, we'll go into this maze of shades. Following the clues that time has tried to erase, but which still reverberate through the years, the investigation revealed parts of the story that no one had expected to find. Sheriff Garrett called in deputies from nearby counties who had dealt with crimes in their own areas, but had never seen anything like this before. They worked very hard and wrote down everything about the basement, including any objects that didn't seem to belong there, and any marks on the walls that suggested more than normal neglect. The heavy attention seemed to come from the very foundation stones of the Wainwright property, making the air there heavy. Things were not going well for Thomas Wainwright and his wife Margaret. They put all of their savings into that house because they wanted to start over in peace and quiet in Missouri, away from the noise and chaos of the big towns. People from all over the area came to look at their house because it had become the center of a mystery. Cars pulled up and stopped on the dusty road as people got there, to look at the gray building that stood out against the skyline. Many people came with questions and their own ideas about what might have happened there years ago. Local newspapers began publishing articles speculating about the property's past. Former neighbors said that the previous merchant, a guy only known as Silas, was quiet and didn't like to talk to people. He kept his business quiet and mostly dealt with things that came from other parts of the state. his sudden leaving. In 1894 had left a lot of questions, but no one thought much of it at the time. In that border area, where starting over was almost a custom, people came and went all the time. That was 3 years ago. Now those questions have a whole new meaning. Garrett started to look through old records to find trends that could help him understand what was going on in the present. He found reports of tourists who went missing near Marshfield over the years. These weren't official cases, they were just mentioned here and there in taverns. Talks and comments from stagecoach drivers who remembered people who never made it to their end destinations. With its winding roads through the hills and large areas of forest, the area had always been a place where people going missing could easily be blamed on natural disasters or hasty choices to change their plans. But there was something in the details that made a pattern start to take shape. All the disappearances mentioned occurred within a specific radius, an area that had. Silas's home was pretty much in the middle of it. Some of the tourists who went missing were last seen at Marshfield's shops, either buying food or looking for a place to stay. Others had just disappeared from the roads, leaving only the tracks of their wagons and no other sign of them being there. The group began to split up. Some people said it was all a coincidence, which was made stronger by the scary find in the basement. Others said Marshfield had been hiding something, without even realizing it. Something that worked in the shadows while people went about their normal lives in the streets that were lit by the sun. People talked about the same thing in shops, churches, and on street corners. It was crazy that no one had seen it. How could so many signs have gone unnoticed? One person who really felt the weight of the finding was Margaret Wainwright. As she walked through that house, she felt hopeful. She thought about where she would put her furniture and how she would decorate each room. Now each. The hallway seemed to be telling her stories that she didn't want to hear. At night, the wind blowing through the window cracks brought sounds that made her mind go to places she couldn't quite put her finger on. The family tried to stay together, but even Thomas, who was very practical and strong-willed, could feel the change in the air in the house. The search went beyond the basement, according to the police. They started to look at the land around the house, the wild areas nearby, and the small streams that ran through the place. Each time a stone was turned or a piece of ground was moved, new information could be found. As the days went by, the story of that house became more complicated and tied into the history of the town of Marshfield. What started out as the finding of one family had become something that affected everyone, a wound that everyone in the community will always remember. If you've made it this far, please tell us what you think in the comments. Sign up for the channel, not to miss what's going to happen next in this story, like if you're intrigued by the direction this is taking. As the investigations went on, a name came up that not many people in Marshfield could remember clearly. In the years between 1892 and 1894, Helena Crane worked as a traveling cook for farmers and traders in the area. She was a middle-aged woman who was known for being discreet and good at cooking. Various records found in the financial books of some businesses show that she had given services on Silas's land for a few months and then vanished without a trace. Not having her around didn't cause any major problems at the time. Helena didn't know anyone with family in the area, and it was usual for workers to be on the move during that time of growth and change. But since what was found in the Wainwright's basement, her name has come up again in discussions. Others thought they might have seen her walk toward Silas's house with her small bag the last time they saw her. Having things. There was nothing but silence after that. It was Sheriff Garrett who found Prudence Miller, an old friend of Helena's who ran a boarding house in downtown Marshfield. Prudence remembered that Helena had said she was saving money to visit a distant cousin who lived in Oregon. She talked about this plan a lot and said she would have enough money for the trip soon. Rudd thought she had finally left for her long-awaited trip when she stopped showing up in town. But there was something. Prudence remembered with a lot of dread. Helena had said that Silas was acting strangely a few weeks before she disappeared. She told him that he made her work late into the night and make meals at odd times. People sometimes came over after dark, but Helena could never really see them because the walls of the house were so thick. All she could hear were their voices. Even though it was getting uncomfortable, she stayed with Silas because he paid well, better than any other boss she had ever had. These new information led to A, adding a new dimension to the probe. How many other people could have died the same way Helena did if she had gone missing in the strange circumstances that were now clear? Garrett began looking for more names and stories of people who had crossed Silas's path and then disappeared into the emptiness of the land. Then there was the case of two brothers who were cloth traders and had been through Marshfield in 1893. It was seen that they were negotiating with Silas while transporting expensive goods, that a big deal could happen that would be good for everyone. People who saw them say they came onto Silas's land at dusk with their loaded carriages. The cars were still parked the next morning, but the brothers were nowhere to be found. Silas told them at the time that they had chosen to keep walking and had agreed to take a ride from another tourist going the same way. The answer seemed odd, but since there was no proof of a crime, no one asked any more questions. These stories now. Each account was separate, but they were all linked together like pieces in a maze. When the disappearances were looked at through the lens of what was found in the basement, they took on a more sinister tone than they had at the time. It looked like Silas's land had been a hub for unrecognized tragedies, a place where people went and then stopped existing. The people who lived in Marshfield started to feel guilty and uneasy together. How could a whole town not have seen what was going on, taking place so nearby? The tone of conversations on the streets changed. When people used to smile at their neighbors, they now look at each other with doubt and suspicion. As the news spread, the trust that had held that small community together started to break down. Thomas Wainwright was in a situation that was getting more and more difficult. The house that was supposed to be a fresh start had turned into a mental jail. He thought about selling it. But who would buy a house with a good name? Even if he found a buyer, would it be right to let someone else handle that risk without knowing the whole story? These questions kept him awake at night while Margaret prayed silently beside him, asking for clarity and peace. The police kept working methodically, but each new find raised more questions than it answered. As the investigation went deeper, it took strange turns and touched people's lives in ways they never thought were connected to something so upsetting. And in the middle of it all stayed. Those quiet rooms kept secrets that might never be fully revealed. It became very important to look for Silas. Garrett sent telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties and even places that were farther away, giving them information about the man and asking them to find him. The account was vague because it was based on fragmented memories of people who knew him from years ago. It could be a man of average height with dark hair and a well-kept beard who always wears simple but good quality clothes. Describe how many guys were crossing the Missouri at that time. It had been weeks since there was any major movement. It looked like Silas had just disappeared into the vast land, turning into another ghost, like all the others that lived in frontier stories. Some people thought he might have changed his name and moved to a faraway city where no one knew about his past. Others brought up darker ideas, like the idea that he might have had a similar end to the ones he seemed to have caused in other people. For now, the people kept paying inappropriate attention to the Wainwright house. People who were interested kept coming by, some just to look from a distance, and others who were braver went up and asked to see the basement. Thomas said no to everything that was asked of him and kept the doors locked and the curtains drawn. The family kind of shut themselves off from the outside world, only leaving when they had to get food or take care of other obligations they couldn't avoid. Margaret felt better after talking to Prudence Miller, who turned out to be a surprising friend during those tough times. Because she ran Marshfield's boarding house for more than 20 years, Prudence knew it better than most people. She told stories about the town's simpler times, when the biggest scandal was a fight over who owned the cattle, or a business squabble between shop owners. These stories gave Margaret a needed balance to the dark things that were happening in her life. Within one of these talks, Prudence brought up something she had forgotten to tell the police. She thought back to a visitor who had stayed at her boarding house in 1895. The man had said that he worked for an Eastern tool company. Even though he was only there for 2 nights, he seemed very interested in Silas's land during that time. He asked him what kind of business he ran, what his habits were, and who came to see him. At the time, Prudence only thought the man was thinking about coming together to do business. But those questions meant something different now. Garrett looked into this tip with more interest. He was able to find records for Prudence's boarding house and found that the man had registered under the name Jonathan Pierce. In the business records of the eastern towns, there was no tool company with that name, as I looked further. The name could be fake. It could be a fake identity made for unknown reasons. Investigators began to think that Silas might not have done what he did by himself, that there might have been a bigger network, taken part. Some people are linked by shady interests that go beyond the lines of a single county. This idea would explain how Silas had been able to work for so long without anyone being very suspicious. If he had helpers or friends who helped him avoid attention or make up stories that made sense for the disappearances, then the mystery was much bigger than anyone thought at first. Things were getting more and more tense in Marshfield. People in the same neighborhood started to doubt each other and wonder if the people they had thought for years may have had something to do with it. Someone else knew? Who had seen something but didn't say anything? The community's social structure was broken by these questions, which led to disagreements where there had been casual acquaintances before. A letter was sent to Sheriff Garrett's office in October 1897, just as the leaves were starting to change color and the air became cold, which is a sign that winter was coming. It was sent by a pharmacist called Albert Dawson from a town more than 300 meters away. In a letter, Dawson said that about a year ago, a guy who looked a lot like Silas had bought strange medical supplies at his store. The man paid with cash and quickly left. One thing about his actions, though, stuck out in Dawson's mind. He only found out about the Marshfield case from a new newspaper that came to his town. This new information gave the study a new lease on life. Garrett went to talk to Dawson himself, bringing an assistant with him in the hopes that they were. We're finally getting closer to real truth. It was a long trip through the fall in Missouri, but Garrett was determined the whole time. He thought they were about to find out something important that would finally start to clear up the puzzles that had been bothering them for months. Garrett's trip to the town where Albert Dawson had a store turned out to be more useful than he thought. Dawson was very careful and kept careful records of all strange events in his place of business. He said that the man he thought was Silas had asked for things that are usually used for storage, as well as some things that have specific medical uses. The items themselves were not illegal, but the mix and amount caught his attention. What made Dawson remember the meeting even more was how the customer acted. The man looked nervously over his shoulder all the time, like he was afraid of being seen. He demanded that the things be packed in a sneaky way and left through the back door of the drugstore instead of going down the main street. At the time, Dawson thought about telling the police about what happened, but since there was no proof of a crime, he chose to just write down the facts in his personal observation book. Garrett made copies of everything that was important and asked the man what way he had gone when he left. Dawson remembered that he had gone west and was probably going back to a place in central Missouri that was more agricultural. This information proved that the man was, in fact, going back to the Marshfield area, or at least going through it. The timeline roughly corresponded to the period in which the last disappearances had been reported. When Garrett got back to Marshfield, he told a small group of trusted citizens who had offered to help with the investigation what he had found. Samuel Harper was one of them. He was a well-known and respected farmer who knew almost all of the area's back roads and trails. Samuel advised that they look into more remote areas where someone might have hidden evidence. Set up operations out of sight of curious eyes. The team started searching the area in a planned way. They found a number of empty cabins which were old buildings that hunters and tourists had used as temporary homes. Most of them were badly damaged, with roofs that had fallen in and walls that were growing plants. But in one of these buildings, which is about 15 kilometers away from the Wainwright farm, they became interested in something. There were signs of recent living there, like ashes from There was a campfire that wasn't more than a few months old, food that had been packed in a certain way, and marks on the ground that looked like heavy things had been pulled. What was even scarier was that they found pieces of partly burned paper. Garrett carefully put these pieces together and tried to figure out what the words that could still be read meant. They looked like letters or business papers, but were too ruined to show what they were really about. This new information brought up new questions. Was Silas using more than one place for his things to do? Was the Marshfield house just one link in a bigger chain? The thought that there might be other places still to be found was very heavy on everyone who was working on the probe. The area was very big, and there were many out-of-the-way places where secrets could stay hidden for years. At the same time, Margaret Wainwright did something that caught her husband off guard. It was said that she would not leave the house and would not let fear or the memories of the past keep her from being there. Had picked out as their house. At first, Thomas didn't agree because he was worried about his wife's mental health, but over time, he saw how determined she was. Margaret said that running away would mean giving up. It would mean letting what had happened there keep having an effect on their lives. She started fixing up her house, with the basement getting the most attention. Margaret hired people to do that job with permission from the police, who were done with their investigations in that area. Clean and reorganize the space fully. She wanted to turn that dark spot into something bright and helpful. They put in new windows that let in natural light, painted the walls white, and put down solid wooden planks instead of dirt on the floor. It looked like the changes that were made to the space helped not only Margaret, but also the whole neighborhood. People started to realize that tragic places could be taken back, and that the past did not have to forever shape the present. Slowly, it took some time for Marshfield to find a new balance, a way to live in the light of day while also knowing about the clouds. But the investigations did not cease. Garrett stayed determined to find out what happened to Silas in the end and what all he had done. He spent a lot of time working on the case and following every tip, no matter how weak it seemed. Because he had lost weight and thick dark circles under his eyes, his wife was worried about his health. Garrett, though, said he couldn't rest while. Some people needed to know what was going on. Families who never found out what happened to their lost loved ones. Marshfield got snowed over in the winter, making the landscape sound like a white blanket. The sounds of the city were muffled, and the feeling of being alone seemed to make the riddles that were still unsolved even heavier. It became harder to get around, and the probe had to slow down. But Garrett didn't let the bad weather stop him from getting his. Do the work. During those months, he went back to old papers, put together timelines, and looked for patterns that other researchers might have missed. Garrett began to notice something interesting during those long winter nights when the only light came from lamps on top of stacks of yellowed papers. The disappearances were not all random. They happened at different times of the year. Most of them happened in the fall and spring when there were a lot of travelers. Increased a great deal. During these times, merchants were able to get goods to customers before or after the hard winter. Based on this observation, it seems like the person or people responsible for the disappearances carefully picked their victims, taking advantage of the way people naturally move through the area. During a meeting in January 1898, Garrett told Samuel Harper about this find. Samuel, who knew the area very well, started drawing lines on a big map that was laid out on the tavern floor, table where they were getting together. He not only marked where Silas's land was, but also where the abandoned cabins they had found were, where travelers had been last seen, and the main routes that merchants took to cross the area. After all of these marks were made, a disturbingly clear pattern could be seen. Silas's property was almost perfectly placed to block a number of different paths. There was no chance in this. The place had been carefully picked out, giving easy access to different trails while staying far enough away from the city to be discreet. The empty rooms made a kind of second network, footholds that could be used for many things. There were rolling hills and thick forests in the area, which made it easy to hide activities that people wanted to keep secret. This physical understanding of the case made me feel like I was making progress, but it also made me feel very uneasy. It meant that everything had been carefully thought out ahead of time. Style and grace. These actions were not rash or based on chance. Instead, they were part of a planned process that may have gone on for years before anyone started to put the pieces together. How many people had really vanished? Garrett feared they would never get an exact number, as many travelers of the time had no family waiting for them or detailed records of their routes. While this was going on, Thomas Wainwright couldn't stop thinking about his choice to buy the house. He started to think about there were signs that he might have missed during the discussion. A lot of people were shocked at how cheap the building was for such a big piece of land. The seller, who said they were an agent for Silas, was moving very quickly to close the deal, which wasn't typical. Thomas didn't look into it further because he was ready to settle down and start his new life. Now, these memories were following him around, making him feel like he had enabled the secrets to stay hidden without meaning to. Margaret saw how much pain her husband was in and tried to help. To comfort him with nice words and good sense. They couldn't tell what was inside the house. They had done what they did because they really wanted a better life. Even though it was scary, finding out the truth was better than keeping it hidden forever. Even though her words made Thomas feel better, he still felt like he had an unseen weight on his shoulders. He felt responsible to help bring justice to those who had been hurt. He began to take a more involved role in conversations with Garrett and the rest of the detectives. He invited them to meet at his house and let them use a room as a makeshift office to sort data and talk about their ideas. Margaret agreed with this choice because she saw it as a way to change her property from a place where secrets were kept to a place where people could find the truth. The regular presence of people working for a good cause helped get rid of the shadows that seemed to live in the building's darkest areas. For the first time since winter, spring began to come. Anne, Nathaniel Cross, an old man, came into town after reading about the probe in a newspaper that made it to his farm in the middle of nowhere. Nathaniel used to drive a stagecoach and take people and mail all over Missouri many years ago. He told many stories about his time working on the roads, and one of them had something to do with Silas. Nathaniel remembered taking a customer in 1891 or 1892. The man said he was an investor interested in buying land in the country. During the trip, a passenger had asked a lot of specific questions about quiet places, places where someone could settle down without being watched all the time by their neighbors. Nathaniel, who was always talking and proud of how much he knew about the area, had talked about the land where Silas would eventually live and said it was perfect for someone who liked private. The writer was very interested, taking notes on directions and asking more questions about the building's history and current state. This thought made me think that Silas, or the place, was picked after careful research by someone connected to him. It wasn't by chance or luck. They looked for a place that met certain criteria on purpose. Nathaniel was upset that he might have helped choose a place that would be used for such bad things, even if he had only done so accidentally. Garrett told him that he had nothing to do with what happened, and that he had only been answering a traveler's normal questions, which was something he did all the time without any ulterior motives. However, the information was useful. For them, it proved that there had been planning on a much bigger scale than they had thought. The person or people who were doing the things on the property had put in a lot of time and planning. Not only did this require resources and knowledge, but it was also so cold that it gave even the most experienced investigators chills. It became clear that what was going on was much more planned and organized than random crimes. Prudence Miller, who was always a source of, a person who cares about Margaret and serves as a link between the Wainwrights and the rest of Marshfield, suggested that the community get together. She said that being open and honest could help bring the town back together after the fights. People might be able to work through the trauma they were all going through in different ways if they knew exactly what was being looked into, how far they had come, and what problems still needed to be solved. Garrett was hesitant at first because he was afraid that sharing information could hurt the investigation or make people panic for no reason. But after talking with Thomas, Margaret, and Samuel, he agreed that it would be good to have some kind of open communication. They set up a meeting at Marshfield's main church and invited everyone who lived in the town. There were a lot of people trying to hear what was being said. They stood in the aisles and even outside the doors. Garrett spoke with cautious honesty. He talked about what they knew, what they thought they knew, and what they were still guessing about. He acknowledged the research's flaws, the size of the area that needed to be looked into, and the fact that some answers might never be found. But he also stressed that they were still determined to find the truth, honor those who had disappeared, and make sure that something similar would never happen again without being noticed. The community had a range of reactions. Some people were thankful that the investigators were honest and worked hard. Others remained skeptical or angry that there were still no clear answers. People shared stories of loss or suspicion that they hadn't told anyone else out of fear or shame, which made the room very emotional at times. The meeting grew into something bigger than Garrett had planned. It turned into a way for everyone to let off steam. The spring of 1898 brought new life to the marshlands, but it also made the investigator even more determined to find the truth. The roads that had been blocked by snow could be used again, which let Garrett broaden the scope of his looks for. He planned organized trips to areas that had been inaccessible all winter, bringing with him groups of volunteers who offered to help clean up the area. Daniel Foster, a young man, was one of these donors, recently moved to the area, but had worked as an investigator's assistant in a bigger Missouri city before. Daniel looked at the case from a different angle, asking questions that no one else had thought of and suggesting new ways to organize the data that is available. He suggested making a more complex system for keeping track of evidence, sorting each piece not only by type, but also by how it might be related to other pieces. Together with Garrett, Daniel started to put all the things that had been gathered over the months back in order. They made timelines that you could see, maps that had specific information marked on them, and lists of questions that were still open. Careful steps like these showed holes in the investigation that weren't fully seen until then. For instance, they found that they had never really looked into the companies that delivered regularly to Silas's property. During their visits, these people may have seen important details that didn't seem important at the time but could now be telling. Garrett started to look for these suppliers and talk to them. People who worked for a grocery delivery service, like Robert Chen, remembered Silas surprisingly well. Chen talked about a careful, person who always paid close attention to every detail of every delivered item. Silas insisted that packages be left in a shed outside and that delivery men never come near the main house. He always paid on time and in cash. When he talked to you, it was short and to the point, with no time for small talk. What Chen found particularly memorable was the quantity and variety of items Silas ordered. Enough food to feed a lot of people. However, Chen had never seen proof of tenants besides Silas. Orders came in for building supplies, ropes, different kinds of tools, and once an unusually large amount of lime. At the time, Chen thought Silas was working on the property in some way, either to fix it up or make it bigger. In a new light, though, these orders look sketchy. Again, people looked for things on the Wainwright property after getting this information. The team focused on the area where Chen said the delivery shed was by using his descriptions to guide them. It was still in the shed, standing, though some damage has been done. Inside, they found pieces of materials that matched Chen's descriptions. What was more interesting was that the floor of the shed had been taken out and put back on at some point in the past. With permission from the Wainwright, they carefully dug down below the barn floor. Each layer of earth was sifted through and looked at carefully. The work was slow and methodical. Thomas was there for a lot of this, and he just watched the men do their thing. Worked hard in the spring sun. Margaret helped the investigation by making meals for the workers. This made her feel like she was actively seeking the truth instead of just watching what was happening on her property. After digging for days, they found things that didn't naturally belong there. Chen had talked about lime-preserving pieces of fabric. There were also buttons of different styles that showed they came from different places. There were also small personal items like a rusted pocket watch and a broken wooden spoon. There was also a comb and a small Bible whose pages were hurt too much to read fully. Daniel carefully organized all of the items by writing detailed descriptions and drawing pictures of how each one looked when it was found. When these objects were found, they made people feel both validated and deeply sad. He felt validated because it proved that his suspicions about who owned the things were correct, but he was also sad because each one represented a life that had been cut short or a story that had ended in terrible circumstances. Robert often found himself battling emotions that threatened to overflow during his work. He had spent his whole life keeping the peace and protecting the people who lived in his area. But now he had to face the truth. He hadn't done enough to protect the people who had met their fates there. Samuel Harper, observing the emotional burden Garrett was carrying, suggested they take a few days off before continuing. He said that everyone should think about what they had learned and that moving forward without giving people a chance to. Thinking about things too much could cause you to make mistakes or miss important details. Garrett at first didn't want to do it because he thought that every day off was a betrayal of the victims, who deserved quick justice. But Thomas and Margaret agreed with Samuel's idea and offered their home as a place for the group to get together. Not to work, but just to be together, eat, and remember that they were people with limits. The members of the investigation group talked about more personal things during these days off. Garrett said it. He told stories from his childhood about how he became sheriff after seeing wrongdoing in his hometown and deciding to do something about it. Daniel talked about the events that made him want to become an investigator and the lessons he had learned about how complicated people are. Samuel told stories from Marshfield's past, from the first settlers who came to the area many years ago and had to deal with a lot of problems as they tried to make a community out of the vast wilderness. Margaret gave her own opinion and talked about how having lived in the house had changed how she thought about home and safety. She said that at first she had thought about leaving, selling the house, and starting over somewhere else, away from the past. There was a better way for her to deal with the trauma, though, through changing the house and especially by being involved in the investigation. Changing the dark place into a place to look for the truth gave her a reason to stay there. Thomas. He didn't talk as much, but when he did, what he said meant a lot. He thought about his duty and his choice, and how the choices we make can take us in ways we never imagined. He was very thankful for the community that had come together around this tragedy. There were people who could have turned away, but instead chose to face the darkness with each other. That showed strength, a group resilience that went beyond each person's fears. There was a different vibe when work started up again after the break. In the group, they stayed serious and focused, but they were also closer than ever. They were bound together not only by a common goal, but also by a shared understanding of the humanities. Being together made the hard work easier to handle, and they kept going even when the discoveries were very scary. The next part of the investigation was trying to find out who owned the things that were found. The pocket watch had partially legible inscriptions that could be initials. Even though the Bible is damaged, had a page on the front where families would write down names and important dates. Daniel took great care to try to preserve and figure out these markings. He used very delicate methods to keep the fragile materials stable without doing any more damage. At the same time, Garrett sent descriptions of the objects to police in other areas in the hopes that someone would recognize something and be able to link it to reports of missing people. This process moved too slowly because it depended on letters that. It took weeks to get from one city to another. With each response, there was a chance of a connection, but there was also a chance of more disappointment if the descriptions didn't match or if there weren't enough records to make a solid comparison. Prudence Miller continued to be an important link between the police and the people of Marshfield. She let people know about the work's general progress without giving away private information that could hurt the project. The board house she ran had turned into a casual place where people could meet to talk, ask questions, share concerns, or just be with other people who were dealing with the same tough realities. She was good at listening and making people feel like they were being heard and understood. And as the investigation went on, this skill became more and more useful. As spring got closer, wildflowers spread out across the fields near Marshfield, adding a splash of color. How different the natural beauty of the season is from the somber nature of the work being done created a dissonance that did not go unnoticed. Things kept going. The weather changed. Nature followed its eternal cycles, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath its green and flowery canopy. Marshfield got hit with the usual summer heat, and the fields around the town turned into golden waves of dry grass that rustled in the wind. The investigation had become an ongoing part of everyday life in the community, a constant presence that changed the way people talked, choices, and even the dreams of the people who have the most at stake. Garrett had set up a strict schedule for himself. He spent each day working in the field, going through documents, and writing to authorities in other areas, who would sometimes give him information that could be useful. During this time, Daniel Foster became an even more important part of the investigation. His organized approach and ability to see links between things that didn't seem to go together were very helpful. He made something he called a pattern book, a detailed journal where he wrote down not only facts, but also observations about actions, choices of where to go, and possible reasons for them. The whole team used this book as a constant reference, a place to look at and change their hypotheses based on new information. Daniel's careful analysis made them start to think about a possibility they had previously ruled out as unlikely. What if Silas hadn't done it by himself? Not only in the sense of having occasional helpers, but in the sense of being a part of a well-run network that works in different places. This theory was ambitious and unsettling, but it made sense of some puzzles that hadn't been clear before. For instance, how had Silas been able to hide what he was doing for so long if he was in charge of everything? It would make more sense if different people had different parts to play and only knew their own part of the bigger plan. Garrett, at first, didn't believe this theory to be true. It looked like. Give it a level of organization that he didn't think was possible at that time and in that area, but Daniel presented clues that, when put together, made a strong case. The dates of the disappearances often lined up with the arrival of strangers in the city, who only stayed for a short time before leaving again. The travel patterns showed coordination, with different people showing up in a certain order, which could mean that people had talked ahead of time about when and where certain events would happen. Samuel Harper gave another useful point of view because he knew a lot about the area. He remembered that there were rumors about illegal activities going on in the area during those years. There is no solid evidence or proof. There are only hints that some individuals were involved in shady activities. At the time, these rumors were too vague to get people to do anything, so they mostly turned into unproven guesswork. But now that they knew more about the property, these old homes looked different. Rumors gained potential significance. The team decided to expand their investigation geographically, looking beyond Marshfield and exploring whether there were similar properties in other parts of Missouri that might be connected. This was a monumental task requiring extensive correspondence with authorities from multiple counties and review of property records that were often poorly organized or incomplete. Thomas offered financial resources to help cover travel and correspondence costs, seeing this as a way to contribute concretely to the search for broader answers. Meanwhile, Margaret had found her own unique role within the investigative effort. She began interviewing women from the community, recognizing that there were perspectives and memories that might not emerge in conversations dominated by men. Many women had observations about changes in neighbors' behavior, about strangers who had passed through town, about conversations overheard in markets or churches that at the time seemed unimportant. Margaret had a natural ability to create safe spaces where people felt comfortable sharing, and the information she gathered often added important nuances to the bigger picture. One of these conversations revealed something particularly intriguing. An elderly lady named Beatrix Thompson recalled seeing Silas in intense conversation with another man outside the property on a specific occasion, probably in the autumn of 1893. What made this memory remarkable was the behavior of both men, constantly looking around as if checking if they were being observed, speaking in low, urgent tones. Beatrice had passed them in her carriage, and although she couldn't hear the specific words, the atmosphere of the interaction had remained in her memory as something clearly furtive. When Margaret shared this information with Garrett and the team, they tried to determine if there was any way to identify the other man Beatrice had seen. She provided a physical description as best she could remember after so many years. Tall, broad-shouldered, red beard, wearing clothes that suggested someone who worked outdoors. It was a description that could match many men of the time, but it was added to the growing catalog of information that Daniel kept organized. The arrival of August brought an unexpected development. A group of workers hired to build a new bridge over a creek about 45 kilometers from Marshfield made a disturbing discovery during their excavations. They found buried objects that clearly shouldn't be there. Personal belongings similar to those found on the Wainwright property. Local. Authorities in that area contacted Garrett, having heard about his investigation through intercount communication channels. Garrett immediately set off to examine the site, taking Daniel with him. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. The burial pattern, the types of objects, even the use of lime for preservation. Everything matched what they had discovered at Marshfield. There was no chance in this. It was evidence that their theories about a wider network were well-founded. The discovery brought intellectual validation to their hypothesis, but also an overwhelming sense of the magnitude of what they were facing. How many other places existed? How many other properties had been used for similar purposes? News of this second discovery spread rapidly, not only through Marshfield, but across a much wider region of Missouri. Newspapers began publishing stories connecting the two locations, speculating about the existence of a criminal organization that had operated throughout the state for years. Undetected. Some of these stories were sensationalist, exaggerating details or inventing unproven connections. Garrett found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to issue public statements attempting to correct misinformation, while simultaneously acknowledging the seriousness of what they had discovered. This increased publicity had both positive and negative consequences. Positively, it brought to light new witnesses from distant areas, people who had read the stories in the newspapers and remembered observations or experiences that might be relevant. Garrett began receiving letters weekly, some containing genuinely useful information, others based on speculation or misunderstandings. Each letter needed to be evaluated and answered, adding significant layers to the already considerable workload. On the negative side, the publicity also attracted less desirable elements. Treasure hunters appeared in the area, people who believed that where there was criminal activity, there might be hidden valuables. Garrett had to dedicate resources to patrolling both the Wainwright property and the newly discovered site, preventing curious onlookers and opportunists from compromising potential evidence or disturbing what was essentially sacred ground where victims had lost their lives. Thomas and Margaret found themselves dealing with renewed, unwanted attention. Their property, which had begun to regain some normalcy after Margaret's renovation efforts, had once again become a focal point of public interest. They received offers from journalists wanting to interview or photograph the house, requests they consistently refused. Margaret, in particular, felt frustrated by how her family was being repeatedly dragged into the spotlight when all they wanted was peace and the opportunity to process their experiences privately. Prudence Miller, observing the renewed stress on the Ways, organized a community effort to protect them from excessive outside attention. Marshfield residents who had come to respect and appreciate the family agreed to serve as intermediaries, politely but firmly discouraging outsiders from disturbing the property. This demonstration of community solidarity deeply touched Margaret and Thomas, reminding them that despite all the difficulties, they had found genuine people who cared about their well-being. Daniel, working tirelessly to integrate the new information from the second site into his existing analyses, began to identify possible additional connections. He noted that both sites were close to intersections of important trade routes, that both offered significant isolation while remaining accessible, and that both had had multiple owners in relatively short periods before the events in question. These patterns suggested specific criteria used to select locations, implying sophisticated planning and detailed knowledge of regional geography. Following these patterns, Daniel created a theoretical map identifying other properties in Missouri that shared similar characteristics. There were dozens of possibilities, a number that made a thorough investigation of all of them virtually impossible with the available resources. Garrett chose to focus on the ones that had questionable ownership histories or were linked to reports of missing people in the area. Even after this filtering, there were still at least 5 places that needed more research. Putting together this bigger investigation required people from many different areas to work together in a way that had never been seen before. Garrett found himself writing long letters to other county sheriffs, describing the situation, sharing what he had found, and asking for help in looking into certain properties. The answers were different. Some sheriffs were genuinely interested and promised to do what they could to help. Others were skeptical or didn't have the time or resources to do more research because they had other things they needed to do in their own communities. Samuel Harper, aware of the difficulties, suggested creating a temporary task force to handle this investigation. He suggested putting together qualified people. people with relevant skills from a variety of fields who are willing to put in a lot of time on the project. The people involved liked the idea, and in September 1898, they started to find people to join and set up a group like this. It had police officers, people who were good at analyzing documents, people who knew a lot about the area's geography, and people who knew how to interview people. When the task force was put together, it changed the course of the investigation and made what had. Started out as a local find in Marshfield and grew into a coordinated effort that covered a lot of central Missouri. The people who came together had different backgrounds and experiences, but they were all working toward the same goal, which went beyond their own personal interests and the area they worked in. Garrett naturally took over as leader of this larger operation. Daniel helped as intelligence coordinator, and Samuel was a strategic consultant who knew the ins and outs of the area. The task force's first full meeting. Late in September at the Marshfield Church, which had become the place where important case-related talks took place. 17 people from 8 different counties came, and each brought their own unique ideas and knowledge about their own places. What came out of that meeting was both very good news and very scary. Several of the sheriffs have talked about cases of disappearances in their areas that had been left unsolved until now. When these cases were looked at through the new lens of understanding that the Marshfield investigation took on potentially evil meanings. A very experienced sheriff from a county northwest of Marshfield named William Blackwood told Daniel that there was an abandoned property in his area that looked a lot like the things Daniel had seen on his mental map. The house had been empty for about 4 years after the owner suddenly left, saying they needed to move to a warmer climate for health reasons. No one had deep doubts about this explanation at the time, but now Blackwood thought he had missed clues that should have made him suspicious. A private investigator named Marcus Reeves, who was hired by a family to look for a brother who had gone missing years before, also took part and carefully explained his own search. Arthur, a rare book dealer he was looking for, had gone missing while traveling through Missouri in 1894. Arthur's last known message was a letter sent from a neighborhood near one of the places Daniel had marked on his map. From that point on, Marcus could never find Arthur again, and the case ended without being solved. Now that he had more information, he saw options that weren't there when he first started his search. The task force decided to split up into smaller groups, with each group looking into a different place. This strategy would let them cover more ground at once while still staying coordinated through regular meetings and sharing results all the time. Garrett stressed how important it was to use the same methods everywhere so that results from various places could be compared in a meaningful way. Daniel made detailed rules that every team had to follow. These rules made sure that all the paperwork was the same and that the procedures were the same. Thomas and Margaret Wainwright were both relieved and worried as they watched the mobilization of this larger operation. Comfort because the investigation wasn't solely the responsibility of it was being shared by a larger group of people in Marshfield, not just a few. Fear, because as the investigation grew, it became possible to find out more disturbing things. Revelations that could prove the horrible things they found on their property were only a small part of something bigger and more organized. Margaret kept interviewing women all over the region, and sometimes she went with one of the teams to nearby places. She learned that there was a casual. Women from different communities were able to talk to each other and share information through family visits, meetings at regional markets, and personal letters. These networks often had information that hadn't made it to the proper authorities, like observations and worries that women had shared but hadn't always told the men in their lives or the formal power structures. One of these trips was when Margaret met Clara Peaton. She ran a small inn in a town about 70 kilometers from Marshfield. Clara had an amazing memory for faces and was naturally curious, which she got from taking in travelers for years. When Margaret talked about Silas based on descriptions Garrett had put together, Clara said she was pretty sure she had seen this man many times over the years, always with different people, but never for more than one night. The fact that Clara kept a detailed logbook of all of her observations made them even more useful. Guests. Many places at the time didn't keep very many records, but Clara did. She wrote down not only names and dates, but also observations about behavior, stated destinations, and any other strange things she saw. This book proved to be very helpful for the investigation because it gave a rough outline of when Silas and possibly his friends moved around the area. Daniel was very happy about this discovery because he knew that Clara's book could help him make a map of the connections that had been only hypothetical before. He worked with Clara for several days, transcribing important entries and asking her in-depth questions about the memories that went with each record. What became clear was a pattern of movement that looked like it was planned, with different people showing up at different times in ways that didn't seem random or by chance. At the same time, field teams started looking into the properties that had been identified. That one was the first one to be looked at in more detail. William Blackwood wrote it. The team that was looking into the site, which was led by Blackwood and included 2 experienced task force members, searched the land carefully for 5 days. They found disturbing evidence that was similar to what was found at Marshfield. Objects that were buried that clearly showed lives that were cut short. There were patterns in the land's use that pointed to hidden activities and signs that more than one person had been taking care of the property, even though official records showed only one owner. This is proof that. The fact that there were, in fact, several locations that were linked gave the investigation a new sense of urgency. Every day that went by without any progress could mean that the people who were responsible hid themselves even more, making them harder to find and hold responsible. Garrett was always feeling the weight of this sense of urgency. He was torn between the need to do careful, methodical work and the desire to speed things up and get clear answers quickly. Samuel Harper, taking note of Garrett's investigation was taking a toll on his mental and physical health, so she suggested that he give up some of his duties. The task force included competent individuals who could take on specific aspects of the investigation, allowing Garrett to maintain overall oversight without personally carrying every detail. At first, Garrett didn't want to listen to Samuel's advice because he felt responsible for every part of the case. But over time, he saw how wise it was. He started to trust her more, the leaders of the different teams, so he could focus on coordinating strategies instead of overseeing every detail. It was good for Garrett and the whole operation that the duties were distributed differently. Leaders of teams who felt more independent and confident took the initiative and came up with creative ways to do things. New ways of doing things were created. Innovative ways to keep and look at evidence were shared between teams, and everyone felt like they owned Everyone involved was more committed after the investigation. Marcus Reeves, the private investigator who joined the task force, brought useful ideas from his time spent working alone. He said it was important to think about things other than what you can see. Also, think about business transactions, money movements, and financial patterns that might show connections that aren't obvious at first glance from other sources. Daniel started looking at local bank records and property after he told him to. Transactions, looking for patterns or strange events that might show how resources were being moved around the network. This work showed us an interesting thing. A number of the properties that were being looked into had changed hands through deals involving middlemen, people who bought homes only to sell them quickly to other people. When these middlemen were found, they often disappeared after the deals were done, leaving behind names that might or might not be real. The use of middlemen on purpose, There were hints that people were trying to hide who really owned the properties by putting more distance between the physical locations and the people who ran them. The level of sophistication of the operation that was revealed was impressive. It wasn't the result of random actions by people, but of a well-thought-out system that had been working for years, maybe even more than a decade. When this level of complexity was discovered, it became clear that completely taking apart such a network, and it would take years, not months, to figure out who was involved. But it also made them more determined, collectively felt that they were finally getting a better sense of what they were up against. As part of her job as a link between investigators and the people and communities affected by the investigation, Prudence Miller started setting up regular meetings where families of missing people could get together, talk about their experiences, and support each other. These meetings were more than just starting points for gets together. They turned into places where everyone could heal. There were places where people who had been through unimaginable losses for years could find others who knew how painful it was in a way that few others could. People who went to these meetings often shared details they hadn't thought to bring up before, which led to new information. Details that, when put together with other people's observations, made pictures that were more complete. Thomas Wainwright found new meaning in his life by giving money to these reunions to help pay for travel. For families who lived far away, but still wanted to take part. He also started working on a project to make a complete list of all the people who were known to be missing in the area during that time. This record would not only help with investigations, but it would also be a memorial for the people who had been lost. It would make sure that their stories were told and that they would not be forgotten, even if no one knew for sure what happened to them in the end. Margaret began after being inspired by Thomas's project, getting family stories from people who went to Prudence's meetings. She wasn't just writing down facts about the people who had gone missing, she was also writing down their whole lives. What did they look like before they disappeared? What did they dream about? Who loved them and who loved them? This memorialization work became very important to Margaret because it turned her own traumatic experience into something that other people could use to feel better. As October went on, as the fall colors came to the Missouri hills, the research moved into a new phase. Once the first clues and patterns had been found, the work shifted to finding specific people by following paper trails and witness statements that could lead to those who were responsible. This was tedious work, requiring patience and meticulous attention to detail that might seem insignificant in isolation, but collectively built solid cases. Garrett still worked, even though he had given more tasks to other people. He worked long hours and would often stay in his office late at night reading reports and making plans for the next steps. After months of not seeing him and worrying about him, his wife finally insisted that he take at least one day off. Garrett reluctantly agreed, and he spent the whole Sunday with his family, telling himself not to think about the investigation and just being with them. Garrett's day off turned out to be more useful than he thought. He went back to work on Monday, having a fresh outlook and more energy. He was able to see parts of the case that his tiredness had hidden. He realized that taking care of himself wasn't a luxury or an indulgence, but something he had to do in order to keep doing his job and being a good leader. He started to tell the other people on the task force that they should also make getting enough rest a priority. Knowing that a good investigation needed people with clear minds and healthy bodies, the months that followed brought about small but important changes for everyone involved in the investigation. Methodical and never-ending work kept going, but it became clearer that some answers might never fully come. Because the area was so big, so many years had passed, and there weren't many records available at the time. Some questions would always be open to guesswork, no matter how hard they looked. Garrett was okay with the fact that this was the case. At first, the thought of leaving any problem unresolved drove him crazy. keeping him up at night with anxiety and a constant sense of not being good enough. But he learned that the work wasn't necessarily about solving every problem by talking to Samuel, Thomas, Margaret, and other members of the task force. Instead, it was about bringing light where there had been darkness, giving voice to those who had been silenced, and making sure that similar things couldn't happen again without vigilance and action. The Wainwright estate had been completely transformed. What used to be a place where scary things were found had become, thanks to Margaret's hard work, a real home. The renovations went on, but what was more important was how the family's involvement in the search for truth and justice made them feel better emotionally. They were no longer just owners of a place where other people's secrets lived. They were also active participants in a process of healing and coming to terms with things. Thomas was especially happy with his project to document things. The writing he did became an important part of both the investigation and the family's lives. They wanted to remember the people they had lost. He kept in touch with dozens of people across the region on a regular basis, telling them about his work and giving them a place to share their own memories and stories. The traumatic event they had been through was given meaning through this work, which turned pain into purpose. Margaret kept gathering stories, keeping alive not only the cold facts of the disappearances but also the rich details of the people who had lived. There were details in her records about the people who died's fears, hopes, and dreams. She talked about their jobs, their families, the places they loved, and the songs they liked to sing. This memorial work gave people who could have been just numbers in official reports a human face, making sure that they were remembered as whole, complex people. Daniel Foster stayed committed to systematic analysis, and as new information was added, his book of patterns kept growing. He came up with methods that would later be used, shaped how similar investigations were carried out in other parts of the country, helping to create a new field of investigation work based on coordinating the study of information from many sources. His job in Marshfield had become a big part of his professional identity, and he would come back to it many times over the course of his career. Samuel Harper's knowledge of the area and wisdom had been important from the start, but over time he took on a more philosophical role in the task force. He helped. Others think about the work's emotional and existential parts, giving their thoughts on how communities heal from traumatic events that affect many people at once, and how time changes wounds into scars that last, but don't bleed as much. Prudence Miller was still the person who made people feel the most about the response. Over time, her meetings changed. They were no longer just about investigating, but also about helping each other and making lasting connections with other people who had been affected. She was good at making places where. It was a place where people could be open and honest, where tears were accepted without judgment, and where hope was grown, even when there was a lot of uncertainty. The seasons kept going through their endless cycle, not caring about the human dramas going on above them. It went back to winter, then spring, and finally summer again. The area around Marshfield stayed beautiful. The hills were covered in white snow, bright wildflowers, and golden grass at different times. This steady nature was a kind of comfort and a reminder that even after very dark times, life went on, and beauty and renewal were possible. Garrett realized that the day he first went down the basement stairs of the Wainwrights had changed him when he thought about the years that had passed since then. He had learned about how bad people can be and how strong people can be. He had seen how traumatic news could almost split communities apart. On the other hand, he had seen those same communities work together to face hard truths and come out of it with a better sense of compassion, alertness, and shared responsibility. People in the area remember the stories of Marshfield and the properties that were connected to it. These stories were not just for fun. They were important reminders of how important it is to be aware of other people's weaknesses and the risks of letting solitude and anonymity create environments where evil can thrive without being noticed. These stories taught us to look past the surface and ask questions. About telling stories that make sense and never forgetting that behind every unsolved crime is a person's life that should be remembered and respected. When we look back at these events that had a big impact on that part of Missouri, we are reminded of how the past still affects us today. The decisions the people who lived through these events made, their bravery in facing hard truths, their determination to seek justice even when it was impossible to find, and their compassion for those who suffered. All these traits can help us figure out how to deal with the problems we face today. The Wainwright house is still there. It has changed over the years into a place where light can come in. Stories are told and kept, and the weight of the past is acknowledged without stifling the present's potential. Margaret and Thomas lived there for the rest of their lives, making it a house that showed how things could be taken back and started over, even after the most upsetting discoveries. The fields close by, the winds that blow across the Missouri hills continue to shape Marshfield. These winds carry whispers of old stories and reminders of mysteries that are still partly hidden by the mists of time. We carry with us the lessons we learned from these stories of darkness and light, loss and strength, secrets that were buried, and truths that were slowly revealed. If this journey through one of history's darkest chapters touched you in any way, please consider subscribing. Way to the channel. Leave a comment to tell us what you think. Every story we talk about together makes us think about how complicated life is and how important it is to never forget the voices of those who have been silenced.